Sure it does, and it provides a little bit of discipline to pricing. We're seeing that now in the IPO market, but ultimately fundamentals are going to drive what happens in the equity markets. And what we've seen is that despite trade war, despite concerns over Brexit, despite even talk of impeachment, we've seen earnings hold up pretty well. Credit markets have still been funding very nicely. And ultimately, the data on the economy here in the United States is coming in strong. Yeah. And much better than what we've seen overseas.
Laura, I like his point that there's some pricing discipline that maybe needs to happen in certain parts of the market. Where do you think that valuations are compelling, and where do you think they're too stretched?
Sure. So right now we're actually neutral on U.S. equities, and we don't see a ton of upside from here until we get more certainty around the trade situation.
Could be years, by the way.
Let's hope not. So right now, within the U.S. equity market, because of this uncertainty, where we're positioning is we're more focused on those domestic consumer-focused sectors over the more cyclical and trade-exposed sectors like technology and industrials and energy.
Yeah, the trouble is the domestic consumer parts haven't necessarily, well, it depends on what they are. I mean, small caps have been struggling maybe more than you would think given this environment, whereas lately some of the cyclical names are showing signs of life. So does it make it tough to try to kind of figure out, or is there just a tug of war happening?
Yeah, it's a very difficult environment to make sense of. I think we have this overhang from trade that could really go either way. So right now our base case is that the tariffs will go through as announced. And in light of that, we are trying to take some risk off the table in those areas that are most exposed to the trade situation. So that being those cyclical sectors that I mentioned, and also some of the emerging market equities have high exposure as well. We also have, as you mentioned earlier, the impeachment scenario on the table, which is also adding to the uncertainties. So yeah, I think in light of that,
let me tie those two things together, trade and impeachment. Does the president have a higher incentive to make a trade deal now that he has the target of impeachment on his back?
No, I don't think so. I think ultimately ultimately trade is going to work out regardless of who's in the White House, frankly, because what's happening with trade is the playing out of decades worth of imbalances that have finally come to the fore. So the slower growth we've had in the United States, the accumulation of debt in the United States, all of those things have created pressures that have led up to this. So this is a much bigger story unless the impeachment process goes in a way that we don't expect. Ultimately, we would think that that the process continues to unwind, and we would expect for the next 10 years or so, we would be looking for the imbalances that were accumulated heretofore to reverse themselves, regardless of who's in the White House.
So same question to you, Laura. Does the president need a trade deal more now, today, than he did yesterday, number one? And did I understand you correctly that your base scenario is that the tariffs that have been announced to go into effect on the 15th of October and then later will, in fact, go into effect?
Yeah, so on the first part of your question, I would not tie those two things together. So I don't think that the impeachment inquiry necessarily changes the situation for trade at this point. And I would agree that trade does tend to be more of a bipartisan issue. And then in terms of our base case scenario, yes, we do think that the tariffs will go through as announced. However, there is a lot of risk and uncertainty around that scenario. So we do acknowledge the potential for tariff tensions to actually escalate.
Either of you think the USMCA will be passed during this president's term through the election? Do either of you think that?
Hard to tell. It's a coin toss.
Yeah, it's hard to speculate on that.